published by an NYU professor. Well, coincidentally, it was published exactly 1 month ago on November 9th by Professor Tunku Vardarajan, and the article was titled Going Muslim. And what Professor Vardarajan argued is that what precipitated the tragedy at Fort Hood, people know what happened at Fort Hood, right? Major Nidal Hassan basically took a gun and shot and killed 13 of his co-workers. And what Vardarajan argues is that what precipitated this is not apparently the racist harassment that Major Hassan actually faced in the army, or for that matter, the overwhelming pressure on army psychiatrists. You know, they have huge number of soldiers returning with PTSD and with horror stories that could frankly just, horrify anyone. That is all this, he doesn't mention this, but apparently all this has nothing to do with his actions. Rather, this was a product of a condition that he sees as being inherent to all Muslims, and that is their natural propensity towards violence. So he argued that Hassan didn't snap in the way that actually postal workers just sort of snap, but he did what he did in a very cold and calculating manner, enacting the teachings of Islam. And here's how he puts it, I'll quote him. This phrase, going Muslim, would describe the turn of events where a seemingly integrated Muslim American, a friendly donut vendor in New York, say, or an officer in the US Army at Fort Hood, discards his apparent integration into American society and elects to vindicate his religion in an act of messianic violence against his fellow Americans. So what you see here really is the logic that all Muslims are, again in Vardarajan's words, inherently, imminently violent, and while they appear to be integrated into American society, right, like the friendly donut vendor or your classmate or your neighbor or somebody like that, in fact, they are just ticking time bombs waiting to explode into violent, murderous rage, right? They are like Manchurian candidates. I don't know if people know that film, but they are like Manchurian candidates who are programmed by their violent religion to kill and murder, and it's just only a matter of time before this happens. Now, if you haven't read this article, I really urge you to do so. It's about 1.5 pages long, that is printed pages. And what is quite remarkable about this article is that, in fact, there is no evidence of any sort used to back up the argument. There is no historical account of Islam, no outline of the contact between the West and the East, no discussion of the tenets of the religion, in fact, nothing really to substantiate this outlandish argument. In fact, Vardarajan himself puts it as following. He says he is making an argument that relies on, quote, common sense and self-preservation, end quote. So really the question before us is, how is it that such a blatantly racist, inherently false, and obviously prejudiced argument can parade as common sense? And if you think about that term common sense, right, it's really a set of ideas that are so obvious and so natural that we're asked not to question it, right? So the earth revolves around the sun, and it's not the case that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That's obvious, that's common sense. Let's take a social example. Back during the era of slavery, it was common sense that African slaves were inferior to white people. They were, as the Constitution put it, 3/5 of a man. And so if you were to make this kind of argument about African inferiority, you could do it in a page and a half because it was common sense. It was the ideas, it was the dominant ideas at the time. And really today, I want to argue that Islamophobia and the demonization of Muslims has in fact become common sense. And so in the time I want to do today, in the time that I have today, what I want to do is a couple of things. One, I want to show that the argument that Islam is inherently violent and that Muslims are ticking time bombs waiting to explode is so ridiculous that in fact it's not even worth the paper on which I printed this article. And unlike Professor Vardarajan, I will actually use historical evidence and facts to debunk his argument. And so that will be the first part of my presentation. But the second part is I want to look at why is it that such a ridiculous argument actually has so much currency today. And I want to argue that it's the product of two things. It's for two reasons. First, this image of the murderous Muslim terrorists sort of lurking in our midst, waiting to jump out and so on, what it does is it serves to justify the horrendous violations of civil liberties that we've seen since 9/11 through the Patriot Act and so on. Just to be fair, by the way, it was not just the Bush administration that did this. The groundwork was laid by Clinton in the 1997 Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. So what this does, what this image does, is it creates fear among people and it justifies the existence of these draconian laws. By the way, not so coincidentally, 3 parts of the Patriot Act are set to expire at the end of the year. But as long as, you know, high-profile terrorism cases are in the media, and think, if people have been reading the news, think about the arrests of Najibullah Zazi and his father, Mohammad Zazi, the arrest of 6 terrorism suspects in North Carolina. This has been front-page headline news for the past few months. As long as these sorts of stories are kept alive, the various departments of the state can continue to harass, detain, interrogate, imprison, and deport Muslims. And later, you know, hopefully we'll have Fahad Hashmi's brother speaking about his case. And I hope someone from the audience can speak about Lynn Stewart and a bunch of other cases. So that's one reason. Second, the second reason really for the existence of Islamophobia is to justify, as Jonah said, endless war anywhere in the world. And the Bush administration called it the war on terror. Obama doesn't like the term. He's dropped the term war on terror, but the policies really continue. So let me quote Bush. Here's how Bush put it. He said, quote, "We're fighting them there so we don't have to fight them here," end quote. Or in his West Point speech in 2002, here's how he put it. He said, quote, "We must take the battle to the enemy, disrupt his plans, and confront the worst threats," end quote. This was really the Bush doctrine. It was the notion of preemptive war. And if you watched Obama's speech last week, it was really an extension of the very same logic. I will use his words. Here's how he put it, quote, "I make this decision, the decision to send 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan, because I am convinced that our security is at stake in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is the epicenter of violent extremism practiced by Al-Qaeda. It is from here that we were attacked on 9/11, and it is from here that new attacks are being plotted as I speak. This is no idle danger, no hypothetical threat. In the last few months alone, we have apprehended extremists within our borders, think Zazi, think North Carolina, who were sent here from the border region of Afghanistan and Pakistan to commit new acts of terror," end quote. In short, not only should the war on Afghanistan be escalated, but it should also go beyond Afghanistan now into Pakistan. Now, if you actually step back for a second and you look at this logic, it actually has a lot of parallels with the logic of the Cold War, right? Think about the Cold War. The key enemy there was the Soviet Union and quote-unquote communism. And what were people told in this country at that time? You know, there are communists everywhere. They're lurking underneath the table. They're in the bathroom. Have people seen that poster that is your bathroom breeding Bolsheviks, I think? That's the name of the thing. And because of this fear that was drummed up, all sorts of draconian laws like the Smith Act and so on were passed. And really what its net effect was to silence dissent, was to basically make sure that those who were critical of US policy were kept in their place. And if that was the reason domestically, internationally, this logic could actually help the US intervene anywhere around the world, because God forbid, you know, you've got to stop communism. Now, the war on terror and its corresponding Islamophobic rhetoric really functions, I would argue, in the same sort of way. It's not identical, but it is very similar. Okay, so let's start with the argument that Islam is inherently violent and that Muslims are ticking time bombs. Well, first of all, it wasn't just Varadarajan who made this argument, right? It wasn't just him who blamed Islam for the Fort Hood incident. In fact, if you do just a cursory analysis of the mainstream media's coverage, you'll see that, in fact, this logic was pretty dominant. So, for instance, I'll give you some examples. The Washington Times editorialized that the Fort Hood incident was a case of, quote, Islamic jihadist terrorism, end quote. Here's how Debbie Schlussel, she is a frequent contributor to the New York Post and the Jerusalem Post, writing on her website, she said that one should think of Hassan, quote, whenever you hear about how Muslims serve their country in the US military. And she continued, well, actually, they do serve their country in the US military, and their country is Dar al-Islam and Greater Quranistan, whatever that means. It's Islamic terrorism, stupid. Wait, that's repetitive. It's Islam, stupid, end quote. Now, this is the right. And predictably, I don't want to give you examples from Fox. You know what Fox said, right? But this is not just the far right. This was the mainstream logic even in CNN and unfortunately even in liberal magazines. A few more examples. This is what Cliff May, a former Republican National Committee member, had to say on CNN. Quote, one of the lessons of this attack ought to be that those Muslims serving honorably in the military, those Muslims who are there to serve their country and be patriotic, they're taking a great risk because they know they're going to be accused of turning their back on their religion by putting their country first. Think about that logic. It says that somehow being Muslim is automatically being anti-American, that Islam teaches people to be anti-West, to be anti-US. That is, if you're patriotic, you're turning your back against your religion, apparently, right? This is the logic even in liberal magazines like Slate and New Republic. Christopher Hitchens argued in Slate that, quote, an alarmingly high proportion of terrorists are Muslim. Marty Peretz in New Republic says, the actions of Hassan have to be taken in light of the US war on terror, which is actually, quote, fighting Muslim men, and lest we forget Muslim ideas. So this is across the board. But let's take on the question that, that gets posed by Vardarajan and others, and I'll quote him again. He says, quote, Muslims may be more extreme because their religion is founded on bellicose conquest, a contempt for infidels, and an obligation for piety that is more extensive than in other schemes. Okay, so there's something about Islam that is particularly violent. Well, it is true. If you look at the history of the birth of the religion and its spread, it is true that it was spread through war and conquest. In the 2 decades after Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Muslim armies did in fact defeat the 2 neighboring empires, the great Byzantine and the great Persian Empire, and they set up, they took over large segments of their land and they set up an Islamic empire. But what gets left out in the telling of this story is the reason why this relatively small Muslim army was able to defeat these 2 empires. The reason they succeeded is because these 2 empires had been at war with each other for almost a century before that. People were exhausted from this fighting, and in fact, in some of the villages, they welcomed the Muslim armies. And once the Muslim armies did set up camp there, unlike their Christian counterparts who persecuted heretics and ruled through fear and intimidation and terror, the Muslim invaders actually gave people a choice. You can convert to Islam or you can pay a tax, okay? And that's because Islam actually recognizes Christianity and Judaism as legitimate religions. Now, Vardarajan says that Islam is more bellicose than other schemes. Is Islam more violent than other religions? Absolutely not. Again, if you look at history, you will find that it is no more or less violent than any of the world's major religions. Let's take the case of the Crusades. People have heard of the Crusades, right? It was basically a move that was launched in the 11th century, and Pope Urban II, in order to strengthen the power of the papacy, basically put out a call to Christians to rid Jerusalem, the holy city, of the cursed race. This is his word, the cursed race of the Muslims, who apparently are torturing Christians in Jerusalem. And he basically argued, theologically speaking, that it was perfectly all right to kill for Christ, and those who fought and died would actually be forgiven of all their sins. Okay? So that was the call for the Crusades. Many people took up this call. They went on a rampage. And the first targets, actually, of the Crusaders were Jews. In 1096, in Germany, large numbers of Jews were murdered by the Crusaders, and historians argue that this was the moment from this moment on, anti-Semitism would become a part of European history. And the levels of brutality, people should read and watch documentaries on the Crusades. The level of brutality was horrendous. I'll just give you one example. People's heads would be cut off, put onto a spear, and displayed so that others would remain in fear as to what could happen to them. Of course, the Crusaders start in Europe, they maraud their way through Europe, and eventually in 1099, they reach Jerusalem. What do they find in Jerusalem? It's not the case that the Muslims are persecuting the Christians. In fact, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all flourished in the city in an atmosphere of mutual respect. In short, the idea that the Christians need to be rescued from the barbarous Muslims was not true. Did that stop the Crusaders? They say, okay, let's just go back. Not a chance. In fact, they drenched the city in blood. And it is said that the blood ran to the knees. I don't know if this is true or not, but certainly it was really a horrendous execution of Muslim men, women, and children, as well as Jews. Some of the Jews actually tried to defend themselves by going into a synagogue. The synagogue was burnt, and the Crusaders were standing outside, making sure that no one actually got out, and everyone burned to death, including children. Now, at this time, the difference between the Crusaders and the Muslim empires were actually quite vast. This is not to say that somehow the Christians were inherently barbarous. That's not the argument I want to make. I want to try to show that these are products of historical circumstances. Europe actually had just come out of a very stagnant period, what was known as the Dark Ages, and was not in fact advanced or civilized. And in contrast, Muslim society in fact was highly civilized in terms of medicine, the arts, philosophy, and so on and so forth. So this level of barbarism really shocked people. And in fact, there was actually no immediate response from the Muslim kingdoms in the area. It took 4 decades before a holy war or a just war could be called. Now, there was a violent response from the Muslim kingdoms, but as one historian put it, it took 200 years to create among the Muslims the same level of intolerance that had been seen among the Crusaders. In particular, the historians Goldschmidt and Davidson put it this way, quote, in general, Muslim militancy and intolerance grew in response to the Crusader challenge, end quote. And by the way, this is one example. But in fact, Christian rulers were no less ruthless towards their own populations. And I just want to say something very quickly about the Inquisitions. You may have heard about the Inquisition. Broadly speaking, it consisted of a series of movements orchestrated by the Christian Orthodoxy and by the Catholic Church to essentially reassert their economic control over Europe. And the Spanish Inquisition, that I'm sure you've all probably heard of, is remembered for its utter brutality, mass torture, and the burning of men and women at the stake. And needless to say, Jews and Christians actually fled Europe and coincidentally happened to find a new home under the Muslim Ottoman Empire, which was far more tolerant, and some of them actually flourished and got high positions in the bureaucracy. Okay, now today, no one looks at this history of brutality in Christianity, at least no sane person, and argues that all Catholics today are bloodthirsty fanatics or time bombs just waiting to go off, right? But this logic apparently is common sense when it comes to the application in the case of Muslims. Let me give you one more example of the kind of hypocrisy going on here. Recently, there was a comparative study done of cable news coverage, 3 cable channels, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, of 2 events that have occurred recently. One, the execution of George Tiller, the abortion service provider, by a Christian fundamentalist, and 2, the coverage of the Fort Hood incident. What the study found is that, first of all, the Fort Hood story was 3 times more newsworthy. There were 458 stories about Fort Hood, as opposed to 139 in the Tiller case. Second, 179 stories, or 39% of all stories in Fort Hood, talked about the Muslim faith and terrorism or terror. Compare this to the Tiller case. 7 cable stories, or 5%, talked about the Christian faith and terror or terrorism. And the term jihad appeared 250 times in the 3 weeks in relation to the Fort Hood case, on average 12 times per day. You don't have the same equivalent in the case of the Tiller case. And this is how the author of the study, Anthony DiMaggio, he concludes this. He says that the conflation of jihad with fundamentalism is dramatically contrasted with the discussion of Christian fundamentalism, which is not referenced a single time in cable news and fails to appear in even one story on the Tiller murder. So I think that really gives you a sense of the hypocrisy and the kind of logics that are used. I want to say something very quickly also about the term jihad. The term jihad is used repeatedly to signify a holy war that apparently the East is waging against the West. But if you actually read people who have studied Islam, people like Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, he argues against this translation, stating that the term jihad actually has two meanings. The first, which is the greater jihad, is the struggle within oneself and against one's weaknesses. And the second, or the lesser jihad, is about self-preservation and self-defense, and is more appropriately described as just war rather than a holy war. And Mamdani shows how this just war has been, quote, occasional and isolated, marking points of crisis in Islamic history, end quote. Similarly, John Esposito, he's a very authoritative writer. He's written a number of books on Islam. And here's how he puts it in his book, Islam, the Straight Path. Quote, jihad requires Muslims to struggle in the way of God or to struggle to improve oneself and or society. 4 kinds of jihad are understood to exist today: struggle against oneself, struggle of the hand, the tongue, and the sword. Okay. All right, so if the demonization of Muslims and the association of Islam with violence and terrorism is so false, then why is it such a prevalent argument today? In other words, what role does Islamophobia play? Well, fundamentally, it is an ideology that serves to justify attacks on civil liberties at home and to advance imperial adventures abroad. I'd like to focus actually on the war in Afghanistan. Now, President Obama, in his West Point speech, laid out 3 goals for the war on Afghanistan, for his escalation of the war in Afghanistan. First, to defeat Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. 2, to train the Afghan army to take over the war so that the US can leave. And 3, to involve Pakistan in rooting out their common enemy from Pakistan. Now, in relation to the first objective, here's how he put it. I'd like to use his words. Quote, our overarching goal remains the same: to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and to prevent its capacity to threaten America and our allies in the future. To meet that goal, we will pursue the following objectives within Afghanistan. We must deny Al-Qaeda a safe haven, we must reverse the Taliban's momentum, and deny it the ability to overthrow the government, end quote. Now, today, actually, it is quite well known that Al-Qaeda has been all but decimated. Various intelligence reports, military sources, even in the Wall Street Journal, by the way. I don't know if any of you read the Wall Street Journal. Front page news in the Wall Street Journal as well, you will find information that says that there are only about 100 Al-Qaeda forces left in Afghanistan. So one has to ask, isn't it a bit of an overkill to send 30,000 troops with the goal of reaching 100,000 US troops to go after 100 Al-Qaeda? Absolutely. And I think when you start to ask that question, this rationale starts to fall apart. Because actually the US has never been interested in capturing Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. And again, just look at the mainstream media and you'll find the answer. This is what the Washington Post reported on October 3rd, 2001. Quote, in Afghanistan, leaders of the ruling Taliban militia, which has been harboring bin Laden, urged the United States to share its evidence with them, saying they hoped for a negotiated settlement instead of a military conflict. The Taliban ambassador to Pakistan, Abdul Salam Zaif, said his government would be willing to talk to the United States about bin Laden, but we don't want to surrender without any proof, any evidence. So they said, we'll give you bin Laden, just give us the proof that he's responsible. October 17th, 2001, 10 days after the US bombardment of Afghanistan began, this is a story from the British Guardian newspaper, which said that even that one condition was dropped. Quote, for the first time, the Taliban offered to hand over bin Laden for trial in another country other than the US without asking to see the evidence first, in return for a halt to the bombing, a source close to Pakistan's military leadership said. What was Bush's response? No way. Absolutely not. So really, this has never been about capturing bin Laden. This has never been about capturing Al-Qaeda and so on. And so what about the Taliban? Has this been about the Taliban? Well, the second part of the quote that I read from Obama suggests that the Taliban provide safe haven to Al-Qaeda and therefore have to be vanquished. And you saw that that too is not true in the quotes that I just read. In fact, there was a huge falling out between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda after 9/11. The political scientist Fawaz Garges actually has a book called Journey of the Jihadist, where he goes around interviewing Islamists actually in a whole range of countries in the Middle East and South Asia. And he shows it's not just in Afghanistan that Al-Qaeda became extremely unpopular after 9/11. All over, people denounced these actions because they saw it as really adventurous and not enabling their cause in any way. More recently, this is what Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, I don't know if you've heard of him. This is a very notorious person. He used to be a former US ally during the Soviet war with the Mujahideen. He is now one of the leaders of a Taliban faction. He's gone against the US, and this is what he told Al Jazeera. He said, quote, "The Taliban government came to an end in Afghanistan due to the wrong strategy of Al-Qaeda," end quote, basically reflecting Mullah Omar's distance that he has tried to put between the Afghan Taliban and Osama bin Laden's group. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but briefly, there are 3 Taliban groups in Afghanistan. There are several Taliban in Pakistan. If you ask the Pakistani government, there are the bad Taliban, the ones that attack the Pakistani state, and then there are the good Taliban, the ones that work with them. So, several factions. One of the things that becomes clear if you read particularly the articles of Anand Gopal, he's the Wall Street Journal Afghan correspondent, he raised out really clearly that in fact there isn't actually a lot of cooperation between these various Talibans. They all have different sort of objectives, and certainly the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban don't cooperate. Again, they have very different objectives. So why do I bring this up? Basically to argue that, Obama said that this region is the epicenter of violent extremism. Like as if, all of these groups are getting together to hatch the next big 9/11. But if you actually look at the facts on the ground, that's actually not true. All right. So if the war in Afghanistan is not about bringing the perpetrators of 9/11 to justice, stopping terrorism, all of that stuff, what is it really about? In a nutshell, it's about access to natural gas and oil reserves in the Caspian Sea, and it's about establishing an outpost of US military power in Central Asia so as to better confront US rivals like Russia, China, and Iran. Basically, if you sort of step back a little bit, since the end of the Cold War, the US has aimed to expand its informal empire throughout the world. Clinton called this policy enlargement, and the US has attempted to use its political, economic, and military power to pry open all the areas of the world and to lock in US dominance. 9/11 presented a golden opportunity for this agenda. This is how Condoleezza Rice put it. She said, quote, "An earthquake of the magnitude of 9/11 can shift the tectonic plates of international politics. The international system has been in flux since the collapse of Soviet power. Before the clay can dry again, America and our friends must move to take advantage of these new opportunities." So for the Bush administration, for the likes of Condoleezza Rice, 9/11 was an opportunity. And really, it is not just the Bush administration, but in fact, Clinton, Bush, and Obama all share this goal. And in the case of Afghanistan, they share a commitment to dominating Afghanistan and the region for the 2 interrelated reasons I mentioned earlier: the geostrategic location and the energy resources. Just quickly about the US's geostrategic interests in the region. People may have read that Russia actually wants to assert its control in the region and make sure that the gas pipelines actually run through its territory. China is very, very dependent on imported energy and has astronomical energy needs, and it wants to assert its power in the Caspian Sea region. Iran is establishing relations, both political and economic, throughout the region, especially also among the Shia population in Afghanistan. And what the US wants to do is to prevent these countries from asserting their power in the region and making sure that it and not they control the new energy resources. That, in a nutshell, is what the Afghan war is about. Now, the problem is this escalation and Obama's war is actually not going to achieve its goals. And I'm not going to go into all of the details. I'll just quickly, go through why this is the case, and then we can have, a discussion later. First of all, sending more troops is not going to create stability. It's going to create more chaos. Why? Because the way it works is that troops show up in a particular, US troops show up in a particular location. The Taliban attacks. The US responds with overwhelming force, bombing, killing people, killing civilians all over the place. People lose their families, are devastated, and then go join the Taliban. So more troops is not more stability. In fact, it's more instability. Two, the Obama administration wants to build an army that can take over from the US. If you look at the statistics of who is in the army currently, it is majority Tajik. Okay, the Tajiks are about 25% of the population. They are 41% of the trained troops, and they are in command of 70% of the army. The Pashtuns, where the Taliban mainly operate, they make up 42% of Afghanistan, and there are virtually no Pashtuns in the army. So what you're talking about is sending a majority Tajik army into Pashtun areas. That's not a recipe for peace. That's a recipe for civil war. Three, the Obama administration believes that Karzai can actually create a central government that then has control over the entire nation. That is laughable. The election was rigged. Karzai made deals with all sorts of warlords who are hated. The idea that he can have any sort of credibility beyond Kabul is frankly laughable. And finally, the idea that Pakistan can actually get rid of the Taliban for the US. Pakistan has no interest in doing that. The Taliban are the child of the Pakistani military. They are the key surrogate of Pakistan in Afghanistan, and they are the key ally of Pakistan against India, their main enemy, who supports the Northern Alliance. So there is no way that Pakistan is going to seriously root the Taliban out. And if people remember the incursion into Swat, which created this huge refugee crisis, well, it created that crisis, but actually the Taliban presence still lingers, still exists in Swat. Where they did root out the Taliban, it was in South Waziristan, and that was because it was the bad Taliban. It was Baitullah Masood's Taliban. So the idea that somehow, Pakistan is going to do this is also ridiculous. But more importantly, what this is doing, what Obama's war is doing, is really destabilizing not only Pakistan, but also the entire region. It risks the possibility of a war with India. And remember, both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers. And even beyond that, even bigger than all of this, is that the war in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and now Central Asia threatens to bring the US, China, Russia, and Iran into increasing competition and confrontation with each other. So that's the potential. That's the larger threat that actually exists right now. So I'm going to start to come to a close with this. How am I doing?
Our other speaker isn't here, so take your time.
Okay. All right. So Islamophobia, as I've argued, is the overarching ideology that serves to justify US imperialism. And as long as people believe that there are Muslim terrorists lurking in our midst, against who we must be protected, the US government will get away with blatantly violating the civil liberties not only of Muslims and Arabs, citizens and residents and so forth, but also of others who are not Muslim, others who are not Arab. An attack against one section of society really is an attack against all of us. All our civil liberties are being attacked, and we all stand to lose from this. Similarly, I think we must reject the idea that the US is making ordinary Americans safer by hunting out those terrorists in Afghanistan and vanquishing them and so on and so forth. As I've argued, that is not the objective. And connected with this, I think we have to reject the claim that the US wants to promote democracy in Afghanistan and to build a nation that serves its people and so on and so forth. This is actually one of the oldest justifications used for colonialism. It used to be called the white man's burden. And it's the idea that the West has a duty, has an obligation, has a burden to civilize the East, because according to this logic, Islam produces nothing but despotism, tyranny, etc., etc. And so it's for the West to introduce democracy. Well, this is a blatant lie. Even a cursory look at history will show that, in fact, this is not true. If anything, you look at some of the movements for democracy, such as the constitutional movement in Egypt in the 1880s, the similar constitutional movement in the early 20th century in Iran. Imperial forces have done everything that they could to squash and crush those movements because a democracy threatens imperial power. It's easier to work with a dictator than it is to work with people who actually have rights and who vote and have their thoughts and ideas taken seriously. So I'll come to a close with this. We have to reject Islamophobia and stand in solidarity with ordinary people around the world in condemning US imperialism. And more importantly, I think we need to be involved in the struggle against the injustices that are happening around us in this city. And I think we need to build, or rebuild, I would say, an anti-war movement that can say no to war abroad and no to war at home. Thanks.